Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us today. So let's get started. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of the organization IsraAid, you're going to want to start listening right now. The Israel Forum for International Humanitarian Aid, otherwise known as IsraAid, responds to emergencies all over the world with targeted help. Whether it's a tsunami in Sri Lanka, a major earthquake in Peru, or a refugee crisis in Somalia, IsraAid is there. And joining us in the studio today is Yotam Politzer, the co-CEO of this incredible organization. So thank you so much for joining us. Now, Professor Dershowitz, Yotam is a true daredevil and hero, and he was actually responsible for getting his organization involved in helping out Yazidi refugees. Now, the Yazidis are a Kurdish religious minority, the majority of which live in current-day Iraq, and since 2014, the Yazidis have been under attack by the Islamic State of Iraq, with thousands upon thousands of Yazidis being killed, kidnapped, or held as sex slaves. Which leads us to a very inspiring woman. Nadia Murad was just a 19-year-old student when her village was invaded by Islamic State fighters. 6 of her brothers were murdered along with 600 others, and Murad was captured and held as a slave by the Islamic State in the city of Mosul, where she was beaten, burned, and raped. She only managed to escape when her captor left the house unlocked, and today she's a Yazidi human rights activist and Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and she recently visited Israel in a plea to get the Jewish state to recognize the genocide of her people. Now, I know that was a long speech, but Yotam, our first question for you is why hasn't Israel recognized the Yazidi genocide, and how has IsraAid, been working with the Yazidis? What does it mean to Israel that Nadia Murad is here?
So first of all, we're at IsraAid, we've been working closely with the Yazidi population since very recently after the genocide. The genocide actually took place almost 3 years ago, on 3rd of August 2014. That's when ISIS attacked the area called Mount Sinjar in northern Iraq. In a course of 3-4 days, they killed and slaughtered about 6,000 men, and they sexually enslaved and tortured about 5,500 girls and children. And as we speak in this beautiful studio, we have to remember that there are still approximately 3,200 girls in captivity. We've been working with them. We've been sending teams from Israel to Kurdistan to provide psychosocial support, trauma counseling for the survivors, to provide medical aid, to provide relief items. The winter in northern Iraq is freezing. And we've also been doing that with some of the Yazidis who were able to flee to Greece and to Germany and to provide them there with trauma counseling. We've been really privileged to have Nadia. She's an amazing, inspiring woman. She was the first one to speak up about the atrocities of ISIS. And since then, she's been advocating. She met, I think, 23 prime ministers and presidents to date. I think the reason that in Israel we were not active enough about it is not because we don't care, it's because of lack of knowledge. And that's what we aim to do when we brought her here. We had a very important event in the Knesset. We had a very successful event with packed full house of more than 300 people here in Tel Aviv University. And really to advocate for the Yazidis because it's such a natural connection. When I first met Yazidi refugees in a camp in Greece, they told me the first country they would like to go is Israel. They really see this bonding between these two people. They said, you're a religious minority, we're a religious minority, we're in a complicated, some say hostile environment or neighborhood, and we really need to help each other. Right. So I asked him, so you need our financial support? He said, no, we don't want your financial support, we want your mentorship. You've been able to rebuild your country after the Holocaust, to rebuild your communities all over the world, and we're now devastated and really need your guide and leadership, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, now we know that this is happening. Now, Professor Dershowitz, why hasn't a single perpetrator of these crimes been arrested or persecuted? And I mean, I'd also like to hear what you think our responsibility as a Jewish state is towards minorities like this.
First of all, the International Criminal Court should open up clearly a file on ISIS for this mass murder. But let me focus on another problem. You cannot get a campaign on a university campus today to focus on the Yazidis or on ISIS. You can't get people from the BDS movement to do it. You can't get radical feminists, radical gay women and men. All they care about is Israel building a couple of more living rooms and bathrooms in the West Bank, which personally I don't support. But the priorities of human rights groups, the priorities of the hard left, is so distorted today that there's so much more focus on Israel's imperfections than on mass murders committed by the perpetrators of these kinds of crimes. So the first thing is we have to get our priorities straight, and the international community has to get its priorities straight. The hard left, the academic community have to get its priorities straight. Until we do so, we will be encouraging these kinds of mass slaughters. And second, I just want to congratulate Israel. It's doing such a phenomenal job. It's not welcome in some of these countries. It has to go there surreptitiously. If Israelis are found in these countries, they can be very badly treated. And so it's remarkable how much good Israel does, even in hostile environments. And, we just have to sit back and recognize the Israeli contribution to trying to deal with these kinds of disasters, some man-made, some natural, and congratulate organizations like Israel and support them. I love the idea that these folks want mentoring. They want to be able to use the model of Israel, building on the ashes of the Shoah, to create one of the strongest economic and military nations in the world with a very high level of satisfaction by citizens with their quality of life. Israel's a model, and instead of being treated as a pariah around the world, it should be treated as a model. And I think promoting the work of Israel and organizations like that do such tremendous good is so important for the world to recognize this and to create a set of priorities that understands the first call of human rights, and that is the worst first. You must deal with the worst first. You don't get to marginal problems until you've solved the really core problems of genocide and mass murder in the world. So congratulations to Israel for the phenomenal work it does.
Absolutely. Now, and Yotam, I also understand that you are trying to bring a group of Yazidis here to Israel beyond just Nadia, correct?
Yeah, together with group of Yazidi activists, we're hoping, and I think we have a real chance of bringing group of Yazidi students from Iraq to learn Israeli techniques in agriculture, in engineering, in innovation, to do some job trainings, and there have been some people coming in small numbers. We're hoping to make it a bit larger, and especially now when we're seeing the process of, hopefully, ISIS influence in northern Iraq is fading out, the process of rebuilding the communities of the Yazidis that was so devastated, I think Israel could and should take a leading role.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, Professor Dershowitz, do you want to respond to that? Or
I think Israel should take a leading role. I think that the American left should take a leading role. I think the international community should take a leading role. But when you have Muslims killing religious minorities in the name of Islam, you just can't get people interested. They think it's Islamophobia. They make all kinds of political arguments why it's not proper to do that. These are absurd arguments. We who have experienced the worst devastation and who have pledged never again have a special obligation to make sure that never again applies not only to the Jewish people, but to any religious and other minorities that are oppressed in the name of an ideology. So it's so important.
Professor, we're going to be talking about this very issue a little later on the show, but let's turn to the refugee crisis in Europe. Now, Yotam, there are over 1.1 million refugees that have made their way from the Middle East to Europe since 2015. Israel also works with many of these Syrian and Muslim refugees. But with increasing terror attacks in Europe, we are seeing these people being targeted as main sources of violence as well. Why do you think Israel should be involved in assisting these refugees? And should Europe be taking these refugees in the first place? Anyhow, this is something also Professor Dershowitz said I would love to hear your response on.
Sure.
First, I would like to share with you a very short story from Greece. When the biggest influx of refugees from from Syria arrived to Greece in the summer of 2015, about 2 years ago, our team went there and was really the first team on the ground. And I remember one day that I was pulling out a Syrian baby, 2 years old. Her boat capsized just before it reached the shore, and she was really shivering and suffering from severe hypothermia. We treated her, our medical team treated her, and after a couple of hours she was okay. Her father, who was a very educated man from Damascus, he was an engineer, he spoke fluent English, he was shocked because it was the first time he saw Israelis, and as you can see in the images, our logo is this big Star of David. So we always joke that the refugees probably think they took the wrong boat. They probably think they ended up here in Haifa or God knows where. Right. But he was really shocked, and the first thing he said is something that I always quote. He told me, "My worst enemy became my biggest supporter. And the people who are supposed to protect me back home are chasing me away." And for me, it was the first time I realized not only the depth of the crisis, because we know about the crisis, we know about the tragedy, but I also see that we have a unique opportunity to build bridges and to change people's perspective. So I think there are two reasons. I think we really need to help because this is the right thing to do, regardless of any political agenda. These are people fleeing for their lives. These are people who suffer the worst persecution a person could think of. And this is the Jewish thing to do. This is the Israeli thing to do. This is the right thing to do. The second point, which is also important, is that it's an opportunity. It is an opportunity to build bridges. And, you know, it's not just because of the work that we're doing. We have to remember that these people are coming with a real identity crisis. You know, their extreme religious leaders slaughter them. Their political leaders slaughter them. And then Israelis, both Jews and Arabs, because we have a lot of Israeli Arabs on our team, are helping them. So it's a very confusing experience, but also an incredible opportunity. So I think we should be doing that.
Professor Dershowitz?
Well, I agree. And I think as far as the general immigration and refugee crisis is concerned, again, we have to prioritize. And the first priority should be to get people out of harm's way, people who will be killed unless we can rescue them, bringing them out. The second priority is to give them a safe place to live temporarily until order is restored in their home country, because the preferred solution, of course, in the end, is to have them go back and rebuild their home country, but they can't do that right now. And the third priority that often gets confused with the first two is giving them permanent citizenship in another part of the world, whether it be Europe or the United States or Israel. That is a low priority in an emergency, in a dangerous situation, and we shouldn't confuse them. That's what happened during the Shoah. There was tremendous confusion. The United States and other countries wouldn't help Jews escape from Germany and Poland and Eastern Europe for fear that they would come and live in this country permanently. It turns out, of course, many did, and they became great and productive citizens. But that confusion should never allow delay in the first two, getting them out and getting them safe. We can worry about whether they'll become citizens later. We can worry about vetting them for security reasons. We can worry about all of those things later. The first priority is get them out and get them safe, and we aren't doing that successfully enough.
Professor Dershowitz, what do you think Israel's obligation is to this refugee crisis? Because we are seeing moves in the government here to kind of, you know, curb the amount of asylum seekers that Israel is accepting. Do we have more of an obligation because we are a Jewish state?
I think the answer is we have an obligation under point 1 and point 2. We have an obligation to help them get out, and we have an obligation to give them a place to live safely in the interim. But that doesn't mean that Israel has to change its character and accept as permanent residents or citizens large numbers of refugees that would be better off living among their own people. We're seeing, Jordan taking a lot of refugees. We're not seeing the Emirates or the Saudis taking significant numbers of refugees. So again, I think we have to make a sharp distinction between a permanent resolution of their status and getting them to safety from a situation where their lives are endangered. I think Israel's obligation extends only to the first two, not necessarily to the third of those issues.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Yotam. I think we all hope to have you back soon.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we could go on about this issue all day, but it's time to turn to our next guest, Tuli Weiss, who's the founder of Israel 365, a leading platform that connects Christians to Israel. Now, Tuli, I understand that you would like to talk about the changing relationship that we're seeing between Christians and Israelis and Jews. So take it away.
I think, first of all, thanks for having me on, Natasha. We're really at a turning point in the Jewish-Christian relations. In many ways, a golden era of Jewish-Christian relations. The church has moved away from replacement theology towards a position where they're embracing Israel, embracing the Jewish people with no strings attached. Millions and millions of Christians are looking to support Israel, but the Jewish community isn't really embracing them back. And so Israel 365, what we do is we provide a bridge to between Israel and the evangelical pro-Israel Christian Zionist community through our website, Israel 365, breaking Israel news, and we even have a website called the Israel Bible, which is all the biblical passages that describe Israel.
Now, what's interesting, Professor Dershowitz, is that one would intuitively think that this is a good thing, that we're seeing, better relationships between Christians and Jews, but we're not necessarily seeing the American Jewish community jump on board with this change, correct? Tuli, can you talk about why that is? And Professor, perhaps you'd like to respond.
Yes, so it's interesting because just recently there was a conference in Washington, D.C. Thousands of Christians with Christians United for Israel were there to show their support for Israel, and the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, spoke, and he said, you evangelical Christians are the best friends that Israel has in the entire world. And that was the Israeli Prime Minister speaking to a group of American Christians. Yet the American Jewish community has time and time again shown that they are not in favor of developing further relationships, at least from the establishment position. And it's strange.
Professor, what is your take on this?
Well, I agree with that. I have excellent relations myself with the evangelical Christian community. They invite me to speak at Liberty University, at other places. I have close personal relationships with some of the leaders, and my attitude has always been, if you support Israel, I'm going to support your support for Israel. Look, we will continue to disagree personally on a range of issues, from abortion to gay rights. But they will disagree with us as much as we disagree with them. But on Israel, we can really come together, particularly to fight against other Christian churches, which are very anti-Israel. Right. The Presbyterian leadership has played footsie with the BDS movement over time. The Quakers, other kind of hard left religious groups in America have turned against Israel. So we need allies among evangelical Christians. We have to understand it's part of their religion, an important part of their religion, that they may try to persuade us to become Christians. That's their right. And it's our right to say we appreciate your effort and we prefer to remain committed to our Jewish heritage. But we should not fault them for exercising their freedom of religion in trying to persuade us to join them. That's a compliment, not an insult, and we shouldn't take it as an insult. So I hope that the Jewish leadership will embrace support from evangelical Christians while continuing to maintain our own independence on religious issues and on some political issues. Also, we have to remember that there's a divided Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, of course, tends to be united through the Vatican, but we're seeing in Poland the beginning, again, of a return to some of the Cardinal Glemp era, where Cardinal Glemp was then the primate of the Catholic Church, who was a virulent anti-Semite and fortunately was condemned by the Vatican for his anti-Semitism. But we're seeing a return of nationalism in parts of Catholic Eastern Europe, and with extreme nationalism sometimes comes anti-Semitism, and inexplicably also sometimes anti-Israel biases. So this is a struggle we have to continue to maintain, but I support your work. I think you're doing great work, and I support those who want to create better bridges between Israel and between those Christian groups that are very supportive of Israel.
Professor Dershowitz, can I ask you a question?
Sure, please.
So many of the churches in the South that we were talking about, who now you could drive down in the streets of Atlanta and see them waving Israeli flags in the front of these churches. But years ago in the South, these same churches were very anti-Semitic. How do you understand the shift that's taken place just in the last few decades?
It's a phenomenal shift, and it's happened so quickly. I really think that it's a result of Christians studying their Bible more carefully and having leaders who have emphasized those parts of the Bible that demonstrate the Israeli legitimate claims to Eretz Yisrael. I mean, the first Rashi, on the first word, Bereshit, Rashi quotes Rabbi Isaac as asking, why does the Bible begin with a story of creation rather than with the first mitzvah? And the answer is so that when people question the Jews' claim to Israel, there will be a biblical answer. And I think the biblical answer has been heard loud and clear. Also, I think that with the changes in the geopolitical system in the world, Christians see Israel as a bulwark against the kinds of anti-Christian attitudes that one sees in many nations in the world, including, tragically, some Muslim nations. So there are a lot of phenomena at work. Mm-hmm. The important thing is the end result has been strong support for Israel, and we have to reciprocate. We can't afford to lose that support.
I totally agree with that. It is because they're learning the Bible, they're studying the Bible, but they've been studying the Bible for thousands of years. And so it is the geopolitical considerations in conjunction with their biblical studies. And specifically, I think the rebirth and the revitalization of the land of Israel, the return of the people of Israel to the land of Israel, made them recognize that the way that they've been looking at Israel for thousands of years has been wrong, and they need to adjust their theology, which they have been doing. And now they are rejecting replacement theology, and they're coming up with ways to understand that God has kept his covenant with the Jewish people, like it says in that first Rashi, and throughout the Tanakh. And that's what we're trying to do at Israel 365 and through all of our websites, is to try to teach Christians about the biblical significance of the land of Israel.
And I think it's important to fight back against those dissidents within the groups. For example, two of Israel's greatest enemies in the world today, both of whom have been very influential, has been Jimmy Carter, who claims to teach the Bible and claims to base some of his opposition to Israel on the Bible, and the virulently anti-Semitic Bishop Tutu in South Africa. Both claim a biblical basis for their anti-Zionism, and Bishop Tutu for his anti-Semitism. You'll notice I didn't call Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite, and I did call Bishop Tutu an anti-Semite. If you look at their speeches and their writings, I think you will see that Bishop Tutu deserves to be called an anti-Semite. He talks a lot about the Jews, and Jimmy Carter tries to stay away from that, but he uses terms relating to Zionism which come awfully close. The Reverend Berrigan was one of the beginners of the anti-Israel push from the hard left. So we have enemies as well as friends among Christian leaders, and we have to nurture our friends and turn them against our enemies, and we have to continue to fight against Christian enemies like Carter and like Tutu and the late Reverend Berrigan, who have had undue influence in persuading people that the role of the church is to oppose Israel.
Well, unfortunately, that's all of the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz, and I'd like to thank our guest, Tuli Weiss, and our guest, Yotam Politzer. If you would like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.